Many people think there's a conflict between science and religion. And before I start, how many people know, well, everybody knows who the fellow on the right is. How many people know who the person on the left is? Raise your hand. Oh, okay. Well then, I was going to say you'll learn at least one thing from my talk, but I guess that's not true. Oh well. So many people think there's some kind of conflict between science and religion, as I'm sure you know. When people find out that I'm a scientist and that I'm also a religious believer, they sometimes ask me whether I have any difficulty reconciling the two. And I've always found that a strange question, and many of my Catholic scientist friends also find it strange, because reconcile implies that there's something that has to be reconciled. There's a fight, conflict. Now, many of the same things that make me a Catholic also led me to go into science. A sense of wonder, a passionate desire to know the reason behind things, a deep conviction that everything holds together in some coherent way. For me, both the Catholic faith and modern science make sense of the world. Science tells us about the things that we can observe and measure. Our faith has a much wider scope and answers deeper questions. Questions about the ultimate cause of the world's existence and order. Questions about the purpose of human life and our ultimate destiny. It tells us about spiritual realities, about God and man, love and truth, good and evil, sin and redemption. The Catholic faith and empirical science are two perspectives on reality that indeed see things in different ways, but not in conflicting ways. So I've been a scientist for 44 years and a Catholic for 68 years, and I know of no scientific fact that conflicts with any Catholic doctrine. So why do so many people seem to think that there is some kind of conflict between science and religion? Well, one reason is that they lump all religion together. Every example of a superstitious belief or magical practices they come across is evidence to them of the irrationality of all religion. And many fail to see the distinction between science itself and a certain philosophy that is often called scientific materialism. Now, materialism is the idea that the ultimate reality is matter and its behavior. Scientific materialists are people who think that materialism is somehow implied by modern science. Now, this is an opinion that is held by many scientists and by many people who claim to speak in the name of science. But it has no claim to being science. It is really just a philosophical opinion. Now, if matter were the only reality, then of course God would not exist, because God is not a material entity. Nor would human spiritual souls. A human being would be nothing more than a complex structure made of atoms, and everything about a human being would be ultimately explicable in terms of the laws of physics that govern how those atoms move. In other words, scientific materialism implies not only that God does not exist, but that, strictly speaking, you don't exist either, at least not in the way that you thought you did. The popular astronomer and science writer Carl Sagan put it this way in one of his books. He said, "I am a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan." Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA, wrote in one of his books, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now, for some, that's what scientific materialism, it's much more radical than atheism. Atheism just says God doesn't exist. For some of its adherents, however, scientific materialism is more than a philosophy. It is a passionately held ideology that sees science as having a saving mission. And that mission is to free the human mind from superstition and irrationality, among which they count religion. For such people, it's not enough that science is good and brings us an understanding of the world. There must be an enemy to be vanquished, and they cast religion in that role. This explains the strange zeal that some materialists, like the New Atheists, for example, have in propagating their ideas. They feel that they're taking part in a grand struggle between reason and its enemies. And religion they regard as an enemy of reason. Now, scientific atheists and scientific materialists have a well-developed critique of religion. And it has at least three aspects to it: a philosophical, a historical, and a scientific. Their philosophical claim is that there is an inherent contradiction between the scientific and religious outlooks, apart from anything science has discovered. The very outlook of science and religion outlooks are contrary to each other. Science is based on reason and evidence, whereas religion, according to them, is irrational because it is based on dogma, faith, and mystery, which involve belief in things that cannot be seen and for which supposedly there is no evidence. Science is based on natural explanations and natural laws, whereas religion is based on miracles and the supernatural. They see religion as a matter of myth and magic, and therefore the very antithesis of a rational scientific outlook. Their historical claim is that religious believers and institutions have been hostile to science and have tried to suppress it. This is powerfully symbolized in the eyes of many by the Catholic Church's treatment of Galileo 400 years ago. And this impression is constantly reinforced in the public mind by the never-ending battle against evolution waged by fundamentalist Christians. The materialist scientific claim is that the actual discoveries of modern science over the last 400 years have debunked or undermined basic Christian beliefs about the universe and our place in it. As the story is often told, science has dealt one blow after another to the religious conception of the world. Copernicus showed that humanity is not at the center of the universe. Newtonian physics showed that nature has no purposes or goals, but is purely mechanical and governed by blind and impersonal forces. Modern astronomy showed how small and insignificant we are in comparison to the cosmos as a whole. Darwin, some say, showed that human life is an accident and that human beings differ only in degree, not in any fundamental way, from lower animals. Advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence are thought to be demonstrating that the supposed soul is nothing but the workings of the brain, a complex biochemical computer. And modern cosmology is invoked to show either that the universe had no beginning or that the universe created itself out of nothing by a quantum fluctuation. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the materialist philosophical and historical claim that religion, and Christianity in particular, are inherently contrary to science and historically have been its enemies. In the last part, I'll discuss very briefly some of the things modern physics has discovered and argue that they're more consistent with what Catholics believe than with materialism and atheism. So let's begin with the supposed opposition between the supernaturalism of biblical religion and the naturalism of science. Now, Christianity and Judaism were never based on supernaturalism, if you mean by that a rejection of the idea that there is a natural order. In fact, scholars tell us that the book of Genesis was in part an attack on the supernaturalism and superstition of ancient pagan religion. We'll have discussions later about Joseph Ratzinger's book In the Beginning, where he makes this point very well. When Genesis said that the sun and moon were merely lamps placed by God in the heavens to light the day and the night, it was attacking the paganism that worshiped the sun and moon as gods. When it said that man is made in the image of God and is to exercise dominion over the animals and other creatures, Genesis was, among other things, attacking the paganism in which human beings worshiped and bowed down to animals or to gods made in the image of animals. In paganism, the world was filled with occult forces and populated by numerous deities, gods and goddesses of the ocean and the forests, of wind and fire, of lightning and sex and fertility, and so on. Jews and Christians, however, taught that there was only one God who's to be sought not within nature and its phenomena and forces, but outside of nature, beyond nature, God who is indeed the author of nature. In this way, biblical religion helped to strip the physical universe of divinity and make it into a natural world, no longer the abode of gods, but merely the creation of the one God. And since God is good, the natural world was seen by Jews and Christians, is seen as something good and worth studying. And since God is intelligent and wise, the world he made must reflect this. It must therefore have been made according to principles and laws that can be discovered by and understood by reason. Biblical religion, then, taught that there is a natural order which comes from God. And what characterizes this natural order and reflects the rationality of its creator is precisely that it is orderly, lawful, harmonious, and beautiful. Consider this passage from the letter of St. Clement of Rome to the church in Corinth, written about 97 AD. St. Clement was a bishop of Rome, listed in ancient documents as the third bishop of Rome after St. Peter. He's mentioned in the canon of the Mass, Linus Cletus Clement, Sixtus Cornelius. In his letter to the church in Corinth, he said, "The heavens, as they revolve beneath his government, do so in quiet submission to him. The day and the night run the course he has laid down for them. Sun, moon, and the starry choirs roll on in harmony at his command, none swerving from his appointed orbit. Laws of the same kind sustain the fathomless deeps of the abyss and the untold regions of the netherworld. The impassable ocean and all the worlds that lie beyond it are themselves ruled by the like ordinances of the Lord. Upon all of these, the great architect and Lord of the universe has enjoined peace and harmony." Or consider this passage from the Latin Christian writer Minucius Felix, writing around 200 AD. He's trying to convince his pagan contemporaries to believe why they should believe in a creator God. And he says, "If upon entering some home, you saw that everything there was well tended, neat, and decorative, you would believe that some master was in charge of it, and that he was himself much superior to those good things. So too in the home of this world, when you see providence, order, and law in the heavens and on earth, believe that there is a Lord and author of the universe more beautiful than the stars themselves and the various parts of the whole world." Now look at what these passages point to as evidence of God, not to supernatural phenomena or miraculous departures from the order of nature, but to the order of nature itself and its lawfulness. The ancient argument was that if there is a law, there must be a lawgiver. If there's order in the world, and I'll talk about this on Wednesday at great length, if there's order in the world, there must be a giver of order. God was the lawgiver, not only to Israel, but to the cosmos itself. God says in Jeremiah 33:25, when I have no covenant with day and night, and have given no laws to heaven and earth, then too will I reject the descendants of Jacob and of my servant David. Psalm 148 tells of God establishing the sun, the moon, the stars in the heavens by a decree or law. The idea of God as rational lawgiver helped give birth to the idea that there are laws of nature. Historians have pointed out that the idea of laws of physics actually comes originally from Descartes and Newton in the 17th century, both religious believers. And Newton very clearly and explicitly attributed these laws of physics to God as lawgiver. Even some atheists concede that the religious origins of the idea of physical laws. For example, the eminent biologist Edward O. Wilson, who died, I think, within the last year, a Harvard biologist famous as the founder of sociobiology, he suggested the following as the reason that the ancient Chinese civilization, for all of its impressive scientific achievements, did not produce a Newton or a Descartes. He wrote, why no Newton or Descartes? A Descartes or Newton? Because Chinese scholars had abandoned the idea of a supreme being with personal and creative properties. No rational author of nature existed for them. Consequently, the objects they meticulously described did not follow universal principles. In the absence of a compelling need for the notion of general laws, thoughts in the mind of God, so to speak, little or no search was made for them. Now, our faith, of course, does teach that there are supernatural realities, such as, for example, divine grace, that have effects in the world. But the word supernatural, which means above the natural, would make no sense unless there were a natural order in the first place. And the concept of miracles, which are extraordinary events that go beyond what is naturally possible, presupposes that there is a natural order that determines what is naturally possible and what isn't. There's no logical contradiction between the idea of miracles and the idea of a lawful universe. For the same lawgiver who established the laws of nature can also suspend or override them. Because he made the rules, he can make exceptions to them for the sake of some greater purpose. As we'll see, the men who led the development of modern science in its first few centuries, the pioneers in uncovering nature's laws, such as Isaac Newton, were almost all devout Christians who believed in miracles. Now, there's a lot of confusion today, even among some religious believers, about how nature relates to God. Instead of seeing God as the author of nature, the traditional view, they see God and nature as somehow opposed or in competition with each other. So there's something has a natural explanation. That means God has nothing to do with it. And if God is the cause of something, well, that means it's supernatural. Many, therefore, look for evidence of God only in what is outside the course of nature or inexplicable by natural science. That is, they look for God only in the gaps in our scientific explanation. Hence the expression, the God of the gaps. And atheists think that by closing those gaps, they will leave God no place to hide. Now, as I said, the traditional Christian view is utterly different. If God, as creator of the natural world, established its laws and gave things their natural powers, then his existence is evident in nature itself and its ordinary processes, not just in the miraculous. This is the message of the following passage from the Book of Wisdom, one of the messages. The Book of Wisdom is a Jewish work of about 50 BC, which we Catholics and also our Eastern Orthodox brethren regard as part of the Old Testament. So it's in Wisdom chapter 13 says, for all people, and this is addressed, this was written about 50 BC, it's addressed to ancient Greek scientists, philosophers. So in a sense, it's talking about scientists. It's actually the only passage in the Bible that I know of that is in a sense addressed to scientists. And it says, for all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works, but they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or the lights of the heavens were the gods that rule the world. If through delight in the beauty of these things, people assumed them to be gods, let them know how much better than these is their Lord, for the author of beauty created them. And if people were amazed at their power in working, let them perceive from them how much more powerful is the one who formed them. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. Now notice the evidence of God to which this scriptural passage points consists of phenomena and processes that are perfectly natural. Fire, wind, swift air, the circle of the stars, turbulent water, and the lights of the heavens. Now, medieval theologians distinguished two ways in which God acts in the world. He can act, and sometimes does act, directly in a supernatural manner. For example, turning water into wine. But he also can accomplish his will through the operation of natural causes and processes, which in the terminology of theology are called secondary causes. It has always been the Christian view that God ordinarily acts in the latter way, through the natural. In the words of the great scholastic theologian of about 400 years ago, Francisco Suarez, oh, I didn't give you the quote from Wisdom. I apologize. Well, there it is. In the words of Francisco Suarez, quote, God does not interfere directly with the natural order where secondary, that is natural causes, suffice to produce the intended effect. This principle was important for the founding of science, for it implied that when confronted by some puzzling event or new phenomenon, we should look first for natural explanations. Superstitious people tend to see the supernatural in every unusual or strange event. But this was criticized by the great medieval scientist theologian Nicholas Oresme, who was also a bishop, a great scientist and a theologian. He said, in explaining marvels of nature, quote, there is no reason to take recourse to the heavens or to demons or to our glorious God as if he would produce these effects directly, any more than he directly produces those effects whose natural causes we believe are well known to us. Another great medieval scientist and philosopher, Jean Buridan, wrote, the philosophers, but which in those days meant scientists. So he said, the scientists explain such marvels by appropriate natural causes, but common folk, not knowing of causes, believe these phenomena are produced by a miracle of God, which is usually not true. In other words, we should first seek appropriate natural causes rather than jumping to the conclusion that something is a miracle. That's why the Catholic Church, in its canonization procedures, does not declare a miracle to be worthy of belief until it has excluded the likelihood of natural explanations. That's the default, natural explanation. Now, this brings us back to the crucial theological distinction, I think all-important theological distinction between primary and secondary causality. I think the failure to grasp this distinction is one of the main reasons that some people see a conflict between science and religion. Now, this distinction is most simply explained, I think, by a simple analogy. There are other analogies that are traditionally used, but I like this one. It's an analogy to a play or a novel. And I think it's also helpful to use the terms vertical and horizontal causality instead of primary and secondary. So consider a play. Take the play Hamlet, which I remember reading in high school. Now, in the play Hamlet, the character Hamlet kills the character Polonius, who has been hiding behind a curtain eavesdropping on him. He kills Polonius by stabbing him through a curtain. So consider the following question. What was the cause of Polonius' dying? Did Polonius die because Hamlet stabbed him through a curtain? Or did Polonius die because Shakespeare wrote the play that way? It's an absurd question, isn't it? It's absurd to have to make a choice because both are causes. They're both true. Hamlet is the cause. Hamlet stabbing him is the cause of Polonius' death, the cause within the plot of the play, which I would call the horizontal cause or the horizontal cause or secondary cause. Whereas Shakespeare is the vertical or primary cause of the whole play and its entire plot, including Polonius' death. Shakespeare is the reason there's a play at all. He's the reason that there are characters, Hamlet and Polonius. He's the reason for every event in the play, including Hamlet stabbing Polonius. He's the reason for all the relationships within the play among the characters and events, including the various causal relationships within the plot. He's the cause of the whole thing. And that is in no way in competition with the fact that Hamlet truly is the cause of Polonius' death. So, by analogy, so you don't have to choose between God, the author of nature, and nature. By analogy, the natural causes within the universe, which are studied by scientists and other people, everybody, are horizontal or secondary causes in the language of theology, while God, as the author of nature, is the vertical or primary cause. And the analogy makes clear how silly it is to treat evolution and creation as alternatives, as both fundamentalists and atheists do. Did this species of animal, say a crocodile or a hippopotamus or giraffe, did that species arise by a series of natural causes? Or because God wrote nature's plot that way? Both. This also makes clear why scientific materialists are wrong to think that we believe with, quote, without any evidence. For a materialist, evidence consists either in directly observing something with our senses or inferring that something exists as the natural cause of what we observe. For example, we observe a compass needle move with our senses, and we infer that the natural cause of that is something which we call a magnetic field, which we don't observe with our senses. But obviously, God cannot be seen in either of those ways because, first of all, he's not a part of nature or a material entity that could be sensed. Nor is he a natural cause within the universe. He's not a part of the universe. He's not a part of nature. He's not a natural cause like gunpowder or electricity. And yet God is a cause. He is the ultimate cause. He is not a cause within nature. He is the cause of nature. And thus, nature gives evidence of God in the same way, or analogous way, I should say, to the way a play or novel gives evidence of its author, even if the author does not make an appearance within the book. Or the way that a musical composition, a symphony, gives evidence, testifies to the existence of a composer, even though the composer is not in the symphony. Okay, so that's the sort of philosophical part of my talk. So let's turn to the materialist historical critique of religion. The idea that Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular perhaps, opposed science and tried to hold it back, is called by historians the conflict thesis. Even many historians of science accepted it until relatively recently, but it is now unanimously rejected by historians of science as a complete myth. It's a recent invention, in fact. This conflict thesis really was concocted in the late 19th century, and that's a whole story that I'm not going to go into. The idea that science was born in conflict with religion, and that there were two warring camps, the religious camp and the scientific camp, is projecting back onto the history of science ideas that arose, as I said, in the late 19th century. In the first several centuries of modern science, and modern science in the sense, the birth of modern science was in the late 16th century and then mostly in the 17th century, the century of what's called the scientific revolution. In the first several centuries of modern science, the scientific people and the religious people were not in distinct camps. They were the same people. Consider the great figures of the scientific revolution. Virtually all were devout Christians. I have yet to find a counterexample. Copernicus, whose work sparked that revolution, was an official of the Catholic Church. Johannes Kepler, famous for his 3 laws of planetary motion, was a devout Lutheran and who announced the discovery of one of his laws with these words, with this prayer: "I thank you, Lord God, our Creator, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation." That was the attitude of scientists for hundreds of years. They weren't proving that God didn't exist. They were uncovering the hidden beauty of God's creation. Galileo, despite his troubles with the church, remained a practicing Catholic throughout his life, by all accounts. In fact, when he was old and could no longer walk, he had himself carried to church to attend Mass. Descartes believed in God and that human beings possess immaterial spiritual souls and declared himself a sincere Catholic. Some people have tried to say he was insincere, but there's no evidence of that. He certainly believed in God and the soul. Blaise Pascal was not only a mathematician and physicist of genius, but a Catholic whose life had been transformed by a mystical experience and who wrote in defense of Christian belief against religious skepticism. Robert Boyle, the first modern chemist and founder of chemistry, was a pious Anglican who said that Sunday was the most appropriate day to do scientific experiments as they were a form of worship. And Isaac Newton, the greatest of all of them, spent as much time on theological and scriptural studies as he did on mathematics and physics. All of them saw their work as showing the beauty of God's creation rather than supporting atheism. And I listed at the bottom a number of other great scientists. In fact, this is a who's who of the great scientists of the 17th century, some Protestant, some Catholic, all religious. I haven't been able to find a clear example of an atheist among them. In the 19th century, this continued for a long time. In the 19th century, most physicists would say the 2 greatest physicists of the 19th century were Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, both deeply devout Protestants. Moreover, the scientific revolution didn't spring from thin air. Its foundations were laid in the universities of the Middle Ages, as has been strongly emphasized by the distinguished historian of science, Edward Grant, who, by the way, I think he's passed away recently. He was not religious, so he wasn't. But it was in the medieval, the university was invented in the Middle Ages. And it was in those medieval universities, which are, of course, Catholic institutions, that for the first time in human history, science was studied and taught on a continuous basis from generation to generation by a stable community of scholars. That is, the medieval universities were the place where science was first institutionalized, given an institutional basis, according to Professor Grant. By the end of the Middle Ages, there were about 100 universities in Europe. And they produced hundreds of thousands of graduates who were introduced to scientific questions and from whose ranks scientific talent could emerge. The scientific community and scientific public created by these universities were the soil in which the seeds of the scientific revolution germinated. Now, a little-known fact that dramatically illustrates the role the Catholic Church has played in the development of science is the large number of Catholic priests who made major discoveries. And I have only time to mention a few of the most outstanding. By the way, on the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists, which I urge you to go to, there's a lot of good educational material. One of them is a list of, at present, 95 important Catholic scientists of the past. These are people who made important contributions to science for which their names live on in the scientific world, and who are believing and practicing Catholics. And this is a carefully curated list, unlike most of the lists out there. But I can't go through the 95, but I'm going to go through the names of some priests who are on that list. So starting with the 17th century, we can start with Niels Stenson, who's more commonly known by his Latinized version of his name, Steno, Nicholas Steno. He is famous in 3 branches of science: anatomy, crystallography, and geology. He was the greatest anatomist of his time, and he made major discoveries about the human body, about the glandular and lymphatic system, about the heart and the brain, and so on. Some parts of the body are named after him, like Stenson's duct and Stenson's vein, and so forth. But his greatest achievement was in developing the theory of sedimentary rocks and the origin of fossils, which unlocked the history of the Earth, and for which he's regarded as one of the principal founders of the science of geology. In fact, in a way, he was the first modern geologist. And if you look up histories of geology where they list the founders, he's always listed first. He left the study of science he was a convert. He was a Danish Lutheran by birth and upbringing, but he became a Catholic. He eventually became a bishop and was known for his rigorous asceticism and concern for the poor. He was declared Blessed Nicholas Steno by Pope St. John Paul II, a towering figure in the history of science. Marin Mersenne, a friar of the Mennonite order, is considered the founder of the science of acoustics for fundamental discoveries in the theory of sound and vibrations. He was actually the first person to, for example, to measure the speed of sound. He also made important contributions to the theory and design of reflecting telescopes. Even more important, he was sort of the hub of scientific information at that time. In that era, there were no scientific journals, there were no scientific conferences, there was no internet. The way scientists learned of each other's work was through correspondence, through letter writing, and Mersenne was the hub of that. Scientists would send letters to him telling him what they discovered. He'd send it out to other people. His religious house became a meeting place of famous scientists. And so the Dictionary of Scientific Biography calls him, quote, one of the architects of the European scientific community. A central figure in science in the 1600s. The Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner was one of the co-discoverers, one of about 5 people who independently and at the same time discovered sunspots with telescopes. And he made the most detailed study of them. That's an actual picture of him in his observatory. And that's a diagram from one of his massive tome or treatise on sunspots. Another Jesuit astronomer, Giovanni Battista Riccioli, developed an extensive star catalog, wrote an astronomy reference work that became a standard for about a century. Together with his fellow Jesuit, Francesco Grimaldi, he made the first map of the moon's surface. He developed methods for measuring time precisely in experiments using pendula, and he made the first accurate measurement of the acceleration of gravity at the Earth's surface. Recently, it was discovered that Riccioli discovered and discussed in detail the important Coriolis effect in physics, 200 years before Coriolis did. Francesco Grimaldi, another Jesuit, discovered the extremely important physics phenomenon of diffraction of light. This fundamental discovery shows that light is a wave. He also named this phenomenon diffraction. Now, since it's now known, since quantum mechanics came along, that all matter, all particles are also waves, so all matter is made up of waves, diffraction is a phenomenon of central importance in most branches of physics. And there'll be whole chapters in both your undergraduate and your graduate physics texts on diffraction, discovered in the 1600s by Francesco Grimaldi. The Benedictine priest, Benedetto Castelli, is a friend and student of Galileo, did foundational work in hydraulics and fluid mechanics. He had himself 2 famous students, Evangelista Torricelli, who discovered the principle of the barometer, and the next person, actually it's misspelled, it's Bonaventura Cavalieri, who was himself a priest and made important advances in the development of integral calculus. Now, calculus was independently discovered by Isaac Newton and Leibniz. And Leibniz paid tribute to the contributions of Cavalieri, eloquently said, in the sublimest of geometry, meaning calculus, the initiators and promoters who performed a yeoman's task were Cavalieri and Torricelli. Later, others, meaning himself, Leibniz, progressed even further using their work. So he played an important role in mathematics. One of the top biologists of the 18th century was a priest, Italian priest named Lazzaro Spallanzani, whose contributions are too numerous to mention. I did notice one day when my daughter Victoria was in high school, I looked over her shoulder and her textbook had I think a couple of paragraphs on Spallanzani. I said, hey, I know, did they mention that he was a priest? Well, of course, the textbook doesn't mention that. But he was a great figure in the history of biology. The founder of crystallography is a French priest, René Just Oy, I think that's how you pronounce it. In the 19th century, the first asteroid was discovered by an Italian astronomer priest, Giuseppe Piazzi. He considered it a planet, and he named it Ceres. Later, it got reclassified as an asteroid when people started discovering asteroids, but now, more recently, the scientific community has reclassified it as a planet, as a dwarf planet. And there's a picture from the Hubble Space Telescope, and there NASA sent what do you call it? A satellite to orbit Ceres and take pictures of it. One of the founders of astrophysics, all astrophysicists know of this person, the Jesuit priest Angelo Secchi. Astronomy is an ancient science that studies basically where things are in the heavens and how they move, but astrophysics goes deeper to ask what are the physical causes of things, what makes stars shine, what are stars made of, and so how do they form, and that kind of thing. And one of the main tools of astrophysics, the main tool has been spectroscopy, studying the spectra of light, and the pioneer in that, the 2 pioneers was one person named Joseph Fraunhofer, who was Catholic, a devout Catholic, and Angelo Secchi. He made the first classification of stars based on the spectra of their light, which is the basis of the present scientific classification scheme of stars. And a beautiful symbol of the harmony of faith and science is the fact that Secchi did much of his all of his groundbreaking work using an observatory that he had built on the roof of a beautiful church in Rome, this Church of St. Ignatius, which I recommend if you're ever in Rome, go to that church. It has magnificent frescoes. But there is science on the roof and divine worship downstairs. The Czech priest Bernard Bolzano, who helped put modern mathematics on a more rigorous foundation. Here's a quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It says he was an outstanding mathematician and possibly the greatest logician, mathematical logician, in his time between Leibniz and Frege, which is 2 centuries. So he was a great figure in mathematics. Gregor Mendel, the founder of genetics, I don't have to say anything about him. And, well, for Notre Dame fans, there's a priest who is a professor here who made helped develop the first synthetic rubber named neoprene. And Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest who is the founder of the Big Bang theory of cosmology. Okay? So our central pillar of our understanding of the universe on the large scales and how it began and so forth, the Big Bang theory, is something that was developed, proposed by this Belgian theoretical physicist, mathematician, and Catholic priest. Okay, so that's a glorious record of achievement. Catholics should not be ashamed. It's tragic. I've talked to many audiences over the years, and I sometimes, I don't anymore, but I ask, what name do you think of with regard to Catholic Church and science? And Galileo. Everyone else, Galileo. They've all heard of Galileo, but how many have heard that many branches of science were founded by priests? It is a shame. So the thing is not to relitigate the Galileo case over and over. It's to tell the other 99% of the story. And so the Catholic Church has a glorious record with science. The Professor Lawrence Principe of Johns Hopkins University, a leading historian of science, has written, quote, that the Catholic Church has been probably the largest single and longest-term patron of science in history. Okay, so that's enough on history. And now I only have 12 minutes to tell you about 100 years of modern physics. So I'm going to try to squeeze this in. It's a shame because I'm a physicist and what I most like talking about is physics, and yet I always have it the last 10 minutes of my talk. So I encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A about physics. I'd like to mention some of the major discoveries of modern physics that seem more in line with a Christian view of the world, or the Catholic view, than with materialism and atheism. So I'm going to talk about, if I have time, 5 of them. Now, for an in-depth discussion, I refer you to my book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. Now, one discovery has to do with the beginning of the universe. And as I'll explain tomorrow, that's not the same thing as the creation of the universe. But the Jewish and Christian view has always been that the universe had a temporal beginning, a beginning in time. That, in other words, it has a finite age. By contrast, the pagan philosophers of antiquity believed that the universe has always existed. And most modern atheists have seemed to prefer that idea as well, that the universe has infinite past, no beginning. Now, as of 100 years ago, the scientific evidence seemed to say, most of it seemed to point to the universe having always existed. In fact, many people came to regard the idea of a beginning of the universe as just a relic of religious mythology. But now we know that Georges Lemaitre's idea of a Big Bang is correct. It's not in dispute. There was a Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. Now, in the standard theory of cosmology, that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe and of time itself. Space and time began at the Big Bang, according to the standard picture. Now, it is quite possible that something existed before the Big Bang, and there are various speculative scenarios that I'll discuss tomorrow a little bit. according to which there was a prehistory, a pre-Big Bang history to the universe. But even if that's the case, there are several strong scientific arguments, theoretical arguments, that strongly favor the idea that the universe did have a beginning at some point, whether if not at the Big Bang, then at some earlier point. So that is the favored view now, strongly favored view. A second discovery has to do with our place in the universe. For a long time, atheists have said that the evidence shows that human beings are just a cosmic accident, a fluke, in a universe that is totally without any purpose. But over the last several decades, physicists, especially in my field of physics, have become increasingly aware that many features of the fundamental laws of physics and the structure of the universe seem to be just right to make the existence of life like us possible. If certain things had been even slightly different about the laws of physics, then we wouldn't be here. These fortuitous features are often called anthropic coincidences. Anthropic coming from the Greek word for human being. Actually, so there are features of the laws of physics and the structure of the universe that make it possible for living things, not just us, but living things, to exist. And these coincidences suggest to many people that we aren't an accident, that the universe does have a purpose, and that part of that purpose is that beings such as ourselves should arise in it. And I could mention many examples of such fortuitous anthropic features of the universe and its laws. In my book, I discuss about a dozen of them in great depth. Now, a famous one has to do with the strong force, which is one of the four known forces of nature, 5 if you count the Higgs force. The strong force is the force that holds atomic nuclei together. Now, it can be shown that if the strong force were about 25% weaker, 25% weaker than it is, almost none of the elements it wouldn't be strong enough, almost none of the elements of the periodic table would have formed. And except for hydrogen. Really, only hydrogen would exist, and that would make life based on chemistry impossible. Another famous example, noticed in the 1950s, had to do with the energy level, an excited state of the carbon-12 nucleus. It turns out that if that energy level, or this excited state of the carbon-12 nucleus, had been only a fraction of a percent higher or lower in energy, just shifted by a tiny amount in either direction, there'd be almost no carbon in the universe. And all life that we know of is based on carbon. So that would have been a disaster. There's not just these so-called fine tunings with certain quantity. Another example has to do, and this is one I wrote a paper on that with some colleagues. Interestingly, some of the authors on this paper were one was a Catholic like me, and another was an atheist. So there's a parameter in our current fundamental theory of physics called the Higgs vacuum expectation value. That's the jargon. And if this parameter, which is very important in our theory of physics, had been slightly different in either direction, you can show that the universe would have not had any life in it. And so one can go on with the examples of these so-called fine tunings. But there's other examples too. Certain gross qualitative features of the universe are very important for making life possible. The fact there are 3 dimensions, 3 extended space dimensions is one, rather than more. The fact the world is based on the principles of quantum mechanics is also very important. There are many, many things about the laws of physics that are just right to make life possible. And a very interesting case is the size of the universe. Many people throughout history have worried about this. Doesn't the immensity of the universe show that we're insignificant? Even the psalmist expressed this thought. He said, when I consider the moon, the work of your fingers, and so all these, the heavens, what is man that you are mindful of him? Now, how can we be important when you look at the immensity of the universe? Pascal, in his Pensées, says, one of his things he says is, The eternal silence of the infinite spaces frightens me. And many atheists have pointed to the immensity of the universe as showing that we don't amount basically to a hill of beans. How can you say that we're important? But actually, the vast size of the universe, far from pointing to our insignificance in the cosmic scheme, in a way does quite the opposite, because it turns out, given the way the laws of physics work, the vast size of the universe is a precondition for us being here, okay? And the reason for that is that it takes billions of years to produce creatures like us. First, you need a lot of astrophysical processes to take place that take billions of years to produce the elements of the periodic table. They're formed in the interiors of stars. And then it takes further billions of years of biological evolution to produce creatures such as ourselves. But if you want, it turns out that Einstein's theory of gravity, the laws of gravity, relate how long a universe lasts to how big it is. So if you were to say, I think God made a mistake here, he should have just made the universe big enough for us, instead of making all that empty, wasted space. Just make a universe big enough for us, like thousands of miles across. That would be plenty big. It would only have lasted about order 100th of a second. Even if you allowed God to make a universe the size of the solar system, which is way bigger than you need for creatures like us, it would only have lasted for hours. To have a universe that's going to endure for billions of years, which is what you need for us to be here, it has to be of the immense size that we see. Okay, so enough on that. I want to, I could talk, there's a natural way to explain some of these anthropic coincidences called the multiverse, and we could talk about that later if you wish. Now, another development of modern physics, this goes back before the 20th century, but it's become increasingly striking in the course of the 20th and 21st century, is that the laws of physics are based on very deep mathematical ideas. The universe isn't put together as Tinker Toys or Legos or something, or it's not just some stuff. It's based, the architecture of the universe is based on very deep mathematical ideas. I'll give you an example. The laws of planetary motion that were discovered by Kepler 400 years ago, very beautiful mathematical laws, they're actually not very deep mathematically. You could explain, they're based on simple algebra and geometry. You could explain Kepler's laws to a middle school student, a bright elementary school student, in probably 20 minutes. But Kepler's laws are based on deeper laws, those discovered by Newton 300 years ago or so. To understand Newton's laws of mechanics and gravity, you have to know calculus. So now you're talking about a college student, maybe a high school senior. But Newton's laws of gravity are actually just an approximation to, come from yet deeper laws, which we now know to be Einstein's laws of gravity, proposed about 100 years ago. To understand Einstein's theory requires much more advanced mathematics, a lot more physics than much more advanced mathematics of tensors in curved four-dimensional non-Euclidean space-time and so forth. So you're learning that usually in a 1 or 2 semester course in grad school. And many physicists think that Einstein's laws of gravity are really just an approximation to, come from yet deeper laws, which are probably, according to most experts, something called superstring theory. And superstring theory, which was discovered almost 50 years ago, is so deep mathematically that even though hundreds of the world's most brilliant, many hundreds of the world's most brilliant physicists and mathematicians who've been studying it for most of those 50 years will tell you that they have barely scratched the surface. They do not really fully understand, haven't gotten their arms around the mathematical structure of that theory. So deep is it. So the deeper we've gone into nature, from Kepler to Newton to Einstein to superstring theory, and it's not just that, you could go through other things in physics. The deeper we go, the richer, the more intricate, the more subtle, the more beautiful, the more profound are the mathematical ideas that we discover. Doesn't this suggest that a mind much greater than ours framed those laws? As the great 20th century physicist Sir James Jeans remarked, and this was a long time ago, but it's even more true today, he said, "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine." And in 1932, actually he gave this lecture at Yale in 1931, but it was published in 1932. One of the great mathematicians of the 20th century who made major contributions to theoretical physics, his name was Hermann Weyl. He said this: "Many people think that modern science is far removed from God. I find, on the contrary, that it is much more difficult today for the knowing person to approach God from history, from the spiritual side of the world, and from morals, for there we encounter the suffering and evil in the world, which it is difficult to bring into harmony with an all-merciful and almighty God. In this domain, we have evidently not yet succeeded in raising the veil with which our human nature covers the essence of things. But in our knowledge of physical nature, we have penetrated so far that we can obtain a vision of the flawless harmony, which is in conformity with sublime reason." And I'm going to stop here because it's been an hour. There's two other things I wanted to talk about, major discoveries one really major discovery, the greatest discovery in the history of physics, which was quantum mechanics. And that has two profound implications. One, it overthrew what's called physical determinism. Quantum mechanics came along in the 1920s. From the whole period, from Isaac Newton up to the 1920s, it seemed solidly established that the laws of physics had a property called physical determinism. That is, the equations were so rigid, all the laws of physics known up to that point had very rigid equations such that if you knew the state, if one knew the state of the physical world at one time, the equations uniquely determined how everything that would happen later. There was no wiggle room. Everything the future is uniquely determined from the past by the equations. That actually had a profound effect on religious belief. It actually led to the rise of deism. It undermined a lot of people's religious belief because they thought that showed you couldn't have free will, because everything you do is rigidly controlled by the laws of physics. No free will, then basically Christianity is in deep trouble. But quantum mechanics showed, and most physicists understand quantum mechanics to have showed, that the laws of physics are not deterministic. The past does not uniquely determine the future. Now, and that's generally agreed. However, there's a more controversial implication of quantum mechanics, which I won't have time to go into. It's in a couple of chapters of my book. There's an argument that goes back to the 1930s. Some eminent scientists, including John von Neumann, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, argued that quantum mechanics is inconsistent with materialism, that you cannot understand quantum mechanics. It doesn't make sense if you assume that it describes everything, not only physical systems that are measured, but those beings, such as ourselves, who do the measurements. The observers, as they're called, cannot be fully described physically, according to quantum mechanics. And I'll just quote two great physicists of the 20th century, Sir Rudolf Peierls, who said the premise that you can describe in terms of physics the whole function of a human being, including its knowledge and consciousness, is untenable. He was not religious, but he's saying quantum mechanics, and he's basing this on quantum mechanics, implies that we are not just physical entities. And the Nobel Prize winner Eugene P. Wigner also said that materialism is, quote, inconsistent with present quantum mechanics. He said that in 1961, but quantum mechanics has not changed since then. So it's inconsistent. I'll stop there, and I guess my summary is, I apologize for going a few minutes over. Not only has Christianity, including the Catholic Church specifically, been a great friend of science and played a very positive role in its history, but the things discovered by science, contrary to what many people think, have actually, in many ways, tended to agree with things that we believe as Christians about the universe and about ourselves. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.